My World Tour project location is the ESMA Museum. It's in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And ESMA, what it stands for, is the acronym for the Escuela de Mecánica de la Armada. And what that actually means is the School of Naval Mechanics. So this was originally not like a Navy base, but it was like a naval officer center. And then, you might be seeing that and thinking, okay, what's the significance of this place? Because that doesn't seem like the type of place would be, become a landmark. But you'll see what it evolved into over the years. So the big theme of all this and why it matters is authoritarianism. So when it comes to what authoritarianism is there's two concepts that are pretty close: totalitarianism and authoritarianism. And the main difference, obviously, they both are very high control governments. People, you don't have your individual freedoms and rights like you would in a democratic system. But totalitarianism, they have more of a total control over the population, over what they're doing. They have a strong ideology, and they're able to mobilize almost all of the people to believe in their cause. Whereas authoritarianism, in some ways, it's a weaker control, and you're going to see that come into play. So that's what authoritarianism is. Can y'all give you one or two examples that y'all know of authoritarianism from the past, and what the consequences of those governments have been? Yeah, that's good. Say it loud so my camera hears.
Hitler.
Yeah, Hitler. Millions of people died. It was a very authoritarian government. There's a lot more examples through history. You have Mao Zedong in China. You have the Stalin in Russia. And it's been a general thing that when authoritarianism or authoritarian governments take over, you get really bad consequences for the people. And that's really what happened here, because the ESMA Museum, it's now a museum. At first it was a naval school and a naval base kind of, but what it's known as now is the Museum and Site of Memory, former clandestine center of detention, torture, and extermination. So Argentina had this thing called the Dirty War. And it's not like a war in the traditional sense, because it was a war of the government against the people of that country. It was against basically what they saw as political enemies. It was against people who were suspected socialists and communists who were going against the ideals of the government. And this all came about because of the military takeover that we'll get to in a minute. But the four big things to know about this museum: it housed political prisoners. There were a bunch of places in the country at the time that were converted into political prison camps. But it didn't just house them. It tortured them. It killed people to get information out of them. At the time, it was quite significant, the Navy's largest detention center, and it's still to this day sitting there as a symbol of what authoritarian control was and what it is and what it can be today. Now, the actual location of it, right? See, this is a map of Argentina right here, and that's right where it is, right there in that point, which is right here in Buenos Aires. It's in the capital. It's by far the biggest city. Here's a population map, and you can see by far in Buenos Aires, that's that big spike right there. More people live there than anywhere else in Argentina. So it's not like even at the time in the 1970s and 80s when this was happening, that it was, behind closed doors. It's not like they went over to the mountainy areas or somewhere in here where no one lived. This was happening right on people's doorsteps. And just to show more about it, this is a basic timeline. So in 1976 is when all this started. Juan Perón, later his wife after he died, Isabel, they were very popular leaders in the country. They had a whole party named after them, the Peronist Party, but they were kicked out of office by the military. They just came in and took control, and democracy was completely suspended. There were no elections for a period of almost 10 years. And General Videla, he was the first general to take power in this, and he began hunting down left-wing Peronists and other subversive forces. And it was basically a right-wing government that had taken over and was trying to stomp out all opposition. Over 30,000 people during these years were disappeared. And disappeared is their term for, we don't know what happened to them, most likely killed, tortured, everything that came with that. And it didn't end until December 1983, when the military finally handed power back over They had a democratic election, and President Raul Alfonsine was elected. So the other thing too is like, we said like Hitler earlier about like our ideas of what authoritarianism is. And Argentina and the ESMA Museum and all this is unique in this situation because you got to forget your expectations about it. Because usually you think about Hitler in Germany, right? You think about Mussolini in Italy, Mao Zedong in China, Stalin in Russia, and it's like one guy that's at the he has power in it. And once he's out, it's over. It wasn't like this. You had 4 different leaders. Jorge Videla was in there for the longest time. You had Viola, Galtieri, Gugnone, and they were all in there because it wasn't one person being in power. It was the military in power, not individuals. That's the key takeaway there. The other thing is, usually when you think about this type of thing, you think about one country, maybe they have one ally with them, but the whole southern cone, as part of Operation Condors, all of those countries right at the bottom of South America, they were all dealing with similar things, and they all had these similar policies. Operation Condor is actually how they would team up. Let's say you had one person who's from Argentina, but he's nearby in Bolivia, and he's a person you think is a subversive force. The Bolivian government, they would work with the Argentinian government, capture that person, bring them back to Argentina, torture, interrogate them there. And the United States joined in and at the time our Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, was a big part of encouraging all this to happen. And it was because of domino theory. This was in the 70s and 80s. The Cold War was going on. The Red Scare was still around there. The fear of communism, that was the threat. It wasn't authoritarianism. Even the United States government was perfectly more than happy to work with and even support these authoritarian governments if it meant keeping communism from spreading at the time. Because that was the biggest fear with Russia or USSR and Cuba and all that. Another thing too, the torture was absolutely open everywhere and fear was the goal. All right, you had over 30,000 people disappeared. You had these things called death flights where they would take people up in the helicopters and planes and push them out, no parachute or anything. They had over 500 detention centers throughout the country. So even though this was the biggest one, it's in the capital, this was everywhere. They wanted people to know about it. And you even had this thing called stolen babies at the time. There were over 500 of them. Because when the government was arresting these political prisoners, it was men and women. And some of these women would come in pregnant. And when they would have that kid, the government, the officers, they would raise and adopt that kid. They wouldn't tell them about their original parents. And over 500 babies were stolen and never knew their real parents because of this. And, like I said, most of their real parents you probably killed. Yes?
This was in like the 78s?
Yeah, from like 1976 to 1983. So right when like Cold War, USSR, all that's going on. So then another big question too. You have this terrible thing happen. So how do you get out of this, right? Well, a big one was the protests. People standing up for themselves. You have this protest movement called the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. And what they would do is they would go out pretty much every week to the town square, right in Buenos Aires, in the capital. And they would protest with pictures, you see it there, of some of the disappeared people, a lot of them their sons and daughters. They say, where are our kids? You need to bring them home. So they put pressure on the government because the government knew, as awful as they were being, the one group of people they couldn't persecute is thousands of others out there in the streets. They need to have every nation in the world fighting against them. So after that, finally, 1983, after the peaceful transfer of power, this is the President Raul Alfonsine came in, and finally you had the first democratic election in 7 years, and then you had, after that, the peaceful transfer of power again and again, reestablished democracy in the country. That's how you get away from authoritarianism. And then remembrance too, to make sure it doesn't happen again. Not only is that important with the ESMA Museum, you also have the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo. Okay, these are some of the same women from that picture there in the 70s and the 80s. They still, to this day, will go out and protest and say, what happened to our kids? Because, some information's been released, but honestly, most of it hasn't. It's not even close. So this is one of the pictures of what, used to be the Naval Training Center. This is what it looks like today. It's been converted into a museum. And you can, again, see all the faces of the people. This doesn't even begin to cover. So over 30,000 people in total were disappeared. This is just not even 1% of them right there. And so the first thing you see when you walk in, you see the importance of the site. You see the remembrance. This right here, this like dirty, cramped, cracked walls of the room, that's where pregnant women were kept. And people, it wasn't just pregnant women, it was everyone. They were isolated, viciously tortured. Another thing too, like I said before, like it's not hidden away somewhere. This is the museum right here. That's Buenos Aires. That's a giant city. It's the biggest city they have by far. And so, you know, then what was once a sign of authoritarian control and how bad a country can get, now it's a reminder of, you know, not going back to that past that they had. This is another image from inside the museum in the basement of it. You can walk in, it's the theater right there, and you can see speeches from the trials of, you know, officers at the time when they were getting investigated after all this ended. And so the quick timeline of the site itself, not the dirty war and all that. In 1998, so over about a decade and a half after all this ended, it was protected as evidence of everything. They wouldn't allow it to be torn down. In 2004, the Navy completely vacated the site, but the government did maintain it because that was important. In 2014, the people decided over about a year's time, they completely renovated it, turned it into a museum, and then very recently, 2023, it was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So the big questions come up from it, again, totalitarianism versus authoritarianism, and it's like, the big question out of anything is how does creating a museum out of the former detention center change the meaning of the site? Does anyone have any ideas about that, about how the meaning of it would be changed by transforming it from this political prison, one of the worst things ever, into the memory of it and how that would affect people?
I mean, probably just, you know, issue repeats itself, despite just not to repeat itself.
Right, that's what I thought too, because the last thing you want is for this type of thing to happen again, so it's always good to keep that in memory. And that's the end of my presentation.